Hello, everybody. Sorry for the delay. We lost power here at the ranch, so we just got it back on, and I signed on as soon as I can. We had a little bit of a thunderstorm here. So let me just get situated. If you know of classmates that had signed in and are no longer here, you may want to send them a quick text. We are having class, and I'll try to send them a quick announcement that we are having class. And again, apologize for the delay. Let me just get ready for the share screen. Oops, wrong thing. Yes?
Why you can't go up there?
Because that is another office up there. I am being joined by my niece, so trying to get everything organized. Sorry, guys. Let me get my share files. Yes. Sit there. Yes. I am uploading right now, and we'll get everything situated. And as soon as we upload, we'll start the class. And while that's uploading, let me go real quick to Blackboard and send out a quick announcement that we are having class. Let me see. Okay, got the announcement out. And it's going to take a while, as usual, because now the Wi-Fi is slow. But everything else is converting. There is a couple of things that I do want to talk about. And what I'll go ahead and do is start that out. Right now. Let me see, how many people do we have? We're missing quite a few, but hopefully everybody will get my announcements. Okay, to begin with, what I want to say is you should have noticed on Blackboard under course materials, you have outlines for expansion, for the 1850s, for the Jacksonian democracy. You also have study guides that are for the Jeffersonian democracy, Jacksonian democracy, expansion to the West, and the 1850s. And you also have essay prompts. This is the final essay. I mentioned it to y'all last week. Sorry, guys, I'm trying to get this adjusted correctly. I mentioned it to y'all last week that we would, you are going to have a final essay. It is to be done at home. This is a final formal essay, so it's not 5 paragraphs. This is, you're going to put everything you can into that essay. And that essay has to be, if you're using documentation, if you're quoting, you need the correct citations, the correct documentation. If you are paraphrasing, guys, that is also something that has to be cited and documented. All documents at UTRGV, or at least in the history department, have to be submitted through a program which checks for plagiarism. So be very, very careful about that. Don't be plagiarizing. And you have the prompts up there. They are general prompts. They are cumulative in the sense that they cover everything since day one to the last day. So I want you all to really think about those prompts. If you have any questions, email me, set a time. We can meet over a Zoom meeting. We have a lot more free time this Thanksgiving week. So if you want to get in touch with me, I can certainly meet with you all this Thanksgiving week or after. But start working on these essays, and they will be emailed. to me. Unfortunately, I cannot get a physical copy from y'all because we don't meet. The other thing that was also posted was the extra credit project. This is optional. This is not something you have to do. But if you do, it is worth a possible, not that you're going to get it, but a possible 25 points to your overall total grade points. They basically are what you're doing is basically finding 5 paintings that are suggested there. You choose from those 5. You don't pick your own paintings. You choose from those 5, and then the rules are on there as to what you do. Again, if you have any questions, contact me directly. Okay. So let me see. I think what am I doing? It says I'm sharing FaceTime camera. I'm not too sure what I'm doing. I want to share files. So let me share the files. I don't know why okay. Is everybody there? Because now I seem like I've lost everybody. Can you all see and hear me? Yes, no, maybe? Yes, yes, okay. I'm not too sure what happened. But okay, so we are going to go ahead and pick up where we left off on Thursday, and that was Texas. Again, we're talking about, again, it's taking its sweet little time. Let me see. Select a slide to begin sharing. Of course, it's taking its sweet little time. It's coming, guys. I'm sorry. This is what happens when you have a power outage at the ranch. Everything kind of goes helter-skelter. Okay. I'm waiting. And we're going. It still thought it had uploaded. Now it is converting. And we're going to pick up with Texas. How many of y'all remember your 8th grade Texas? No, was it 7th grade when you take Texas history? Hopefully you remember a lot of it. It should be. Texas is a very fascinating 7th grade. Yeah. Texas is very fascinating. It is the only state that was ever its own independent country. Anybody know how long we were an independent country for? See if y'all remember your Texas history. Nobody? We were an independent country for 9 years. So it's pretty cool. Okay, here we are. Here is the slide. And for some reason, I don't know. Okay, there we are. So we are going to pick up here with Texas, or as it was known in Spain and in Mexico, Texas. Now, Texas or Texas had been part of the far northern Spanish frontier, as you all know. It was part of the Spanish borderlands. It was part of the Mexican borderlands in 1821 when Texas becomes or is part of the new Mexico. Now, the biggest or most thriving community in the center of Texas was San Antonio, which had its colonial roots. We talked about that earlier at the beginning of the semester. But you also had a thriving little kind of fort in the pass through the mountains along the northern banks of the Rio Grande River, and that was called El Paso. Now remember, all of the far northern frontier of Mexico is very large, and it is sparsely populated, as well as Texas. And one of the things that many of the Mexicans were concerned with was not only that they have population there to legitimize their claim to that land, but also to control contraband. These far northern frontiers, particularly Texas, was an area where a lot of contraband could go, where people wouldn't pay taxes or import or export duties because of their proximity to, for example, Louisiana, which was the United States, or to access to the Gulf of Mexico. So it was important to control that contraband for the government. It was a way that they could get revenue. So Mexico, if you all remember, is going to open up these lands with a very generous land policy. And the idea was you get access to cheap land in Texas or in the Mexican northern frontier. But Texas really is the first opened up. And the idea was you had to follow, you would get a Mexican land grant, and you had to follow 3 basic rules. One, you had to become a Mexican citizen. The second, you had to espouse Catholicism. And 3, you needed to learn Spanish. And if you followed these 3 rules, they would give you these very generous land grants. Impresarios, individuals would take advantage of these land grants, and then they would, create kind of a land project where they would bring in families that are taking advantage of these land grants. Many U.S. citizens will come to Texas, particularly from the South. Think of Texas's proximity. It is closer to southern states, to Arkansas, to Louisiana. It's much closer to those states and the southern region of the United States. So it makes kind of common sense that these would probably be the individuals that would be coming to Texas. But there are going to be others that take advantage. And not only U.S. citizens, you will have Irish, Germans, people coming from other countries coming to take advantage of this generous Mexican land rules. One of the Americans taking advantage of this Mexican land policy was a man by the name of Moses Austin, an American who originally had the contact and the contract with Mexico to bring in about 300 families to Texas. He will die, and it will be his son, Stephen F. Austin, who in 1822 does bring about 300 families to central Texas, where this land was very fertile. There were rivers, and they want to make a go of it in central Texas. This 300 families that came were known as the Old 300. So this cheap land, it attracted a lot of people, and a lot of people come to Mexico. And you have a very interesting development happening now, particularly in central Texas where San Antonio was, but you'll kind of see it in East Texas. There's kind of this blend happening with the Mexican Tejanos, who were of Hispanic descent, and these new American Texans, or Texicans as they were called. And in the beginning, because you see the Tejanos are the ones with more of the land, you see a lot of these young Americans kind of marrying into what would have been the landed gentry. One great example of this is American Jim Bowie, who married into one of the largest landholding families around San Antonio. Things prosper in Texas. 2 things. Many of the Americans coming over are Southerners. So they are either coming with slaves or are accepting of slavery. The second thing is all the immigrants to Texas, whether they are Irish, German, American, they're very far from Mexico City. Even the Tejanos, they're all very far from Mexico City. And what you see developing in this Texas region is a very independent streak. In the 1820s, the Mexican administration decides to make a report. Go in and see what's going on in Texas, see what we need to do about the land policy, do any twerks, any things that we need to fix. And General Mier y Terán goes into Texas to investigate what is happening in Texas. And to his shock, he comes back with a very interesting report called the Mier y Terán report. He announces that in Texas, it was a little disturbing. Not so much that these immigrants were coming in, but the fact that Spanish wasn't being spoken. That there seemed to be an acceptance more of U.S. culture than Mexican culture. Catholicism wasn't being practiced. Catholicism at the time was very intertwined with the Mexican culture and government. And so there was this feeling that, wait a minute, all these immigrants, particularly the American influence and the proximity of the U.S. to Texas, is bringing in a different influence. It's instead of the Mexicans influencing the Americans, so to speak, the Americans are influencing the Mexicans. And so in 1829, Mexico issues a new decree. First of all, they will no longer allow slavery. Most Americans were from the South. In a way, Mexico was trying to maybe curb the influence. And so they've made this big decree: no more slavery. We're not going to allow it. But this influence and proximity to the United States and the immigrants coming, even the Germans and the Irish, this influence of American liberty, inspired all the way back from the Declaration of Independence, this concept of the way a government should prosper and work with individual rights and state rights being important. It is starting, even the Tejanos are starting going, wait a minute, this is kind of opposite what we're getting from the Mexican government. And the further, and again, I'm trying to really emphasize, the further away you are sometimes from the central government, the more independent populations become. And Mexico makes these really kind of strange attempts to enforce laws over Texas. And it's having kind of the different effect, the reverse effect of what Mexico wants. Instead of getting and controlling perhaps the Anglo-American population, what they're doing is they're getting more of the Mexican population to support the Anglo ideas of liberty and U.S. government and the way the government should prosper and freedom of business. By 1830, there were actually more Anglo-Texans than Mexican Texans. Mexico City will ban further U.S. immigration into Texas. At the same time, it increases tariffs. Things imported into Texas, they're going to have to pay a higher price, a higher tax on it. And it rescinded property taxes. So the people that had gotten a break from these cheap properties are now going to have to start paying high taxes on it. And many were not complying with the slavery rule. As the 1830s progress, Mexico itself is undergoing political turmoil. Texas is very far away from Mexico City. And in Mexico, there is a rise of a new president, military general, and eventually dictator. His name is General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He arises to power in 1834. His concept of government is to have everything very centralized. All power comes from Mexico City. All power comes from him. And so as his power increases and it becomes more centralized, the far out provinces, particularly Texas, and you can even say New Mexico and California, the further away you were from Mexico City, this control coming from some big central power starting to be reminiscent to many of what England had tried to do to the colonies. He then repeals a constitution, which was the Constitution of 1824. This constitution had allowed a lot more states' rights and state self-determination, and had allowed a lot of these northern borderlands a lot more freedom. What ends up happening is that Texicans, Tejanos, and many other groups that were there in Texas actually unite and decide to revolt against Santa Anna and this new centralized regime. In October 1835, the Texas Revolution starts. And there is a siege by these Texan patriots around San Antonio, and for 6 weeks. And they basically get rid of all the Mexican troops out of San Antonio. San Antonio was the largest kind of sense of Mexican power, and the Mexican troops are sent south of the Rio Grande. At that point, Santa Anna says, fine, we are going to make an example of Texas. And he decides a two-prong attack, 2 battalions of military to come, one by way of Laredo and the other by way of Matamoros, to go up through what is present day Brownsville. The one from Matamoros would be under the direction of General Urea. Its goal was to go up to Golia to get some Texans out of there and go on to East Texas. Santa Anna was going to go from San Luis Potosí to Laredo and then go on to San Antonio and make an example there. Texas will declare itself independent on March 2nd, 1836, and the Republic of Texas begins. It makes a constitution very similar to the Constitution of the United States, with the same kind of three branches of government, separation of powers, very, very similar to the United States. One big difference. This Constitution formally protects slavery. Many people will be involved in this revolution. You'll have the Texicans, or the Anglo-Texans, the Tejanos, Mexican Texans. In fact, one of the biggest promoters for the revolution was a very well-known man who owned a lot of land, Juan Seguin. Unfortunately, we'll talk about later, after the Texas Revolution, where prejudice is going to raise its little head. Anyhow, the new Texas Republic will make general of the new Texas Army Sam Houston. And Sam Houston, kind of learning from George Washington, realizes that his group of Texas volunteers needs time. They need to train. At the time, Mexico had one of the largest armies in the world. A lot of people don't realize this. And Santa Anna was a very, very well-respected military leader, general. In fact, he was called Generalissimo. In February 23rd, Santa Anna arrives outside of San Antonio, and he's going to lay siege around San Antonio. The Texans had decided to take protection in an old mission, San Antonio de Valero. It was affectionately known as the Alamo. Here at the Alamo, there will be Texas volunteers, there will be Mexican Tejanos, there will be Irish immigrants, and there will also be many volunteers that have come from various parts, particularly from the United States, like Davy Crockett, who came from Tennessee with volunteers to support Texas's movement for freedom. Davy Crockett was a very well-known Tennessee frontiersman. He had also been a congressman in Washington, D.C., so he was a very well-known figure. Many Americans are identifying with the Texas Revolution because they see it in a way very similar to the experience of the 13 colonies against the British Empire. So many Americans supported the Texas independence movement. Well, Santa Anna decides to lay siege around the Alamo between February 23rd and March 6, 1836. While they are there, the leader of the Alamo, Colonel William Travis, who is joined by Davy Crockett, Colonel James Bowie, and others, realizes that he is not going to get reinforcements. That Sam Houston is not going to be able to send him reinforcements. And the other battalion that he hoped he would get help from Colonel Fanning over in Goliad is not going to send reinforcements. They are basically stuck alone in the Alamo. They realize a few things. One, if they can hold out the longest possible, they'll be giving Sam Houston and other Texans more time to prepare. There are many myths, many stories that go along with the Alamo. There are some stories that a line was drawn in the sand and that William Travis made this very famous speech and said, anybody that wants to cross this line, leave now, because we probably are going to die here, so to speak. And nobody crossed the line. We don't know if that actually happened. I'm pretty sure that those that were at the Alamo were very aware of what was going to happen, that they were surrounded by an army of Santa Anna that totaled about 5,000 men. And one of the things that Santa Anna also did, which cost him a lot of popularity in Mexico, is that as he would march through Mexico going to San Antonio, he very much took men with him. Like, he would go through the villages and he would put them into the army. So he had a lot of numbers, some numbers that we're not even totally sure about the full numbers, but it was a very large number. They obviously have more weapons. They have more cannon power. It's not a guarantee that they're going to lose at the Alamo for the Texans, but it's very apparent. There is also a story about what is known as the Yellow Rose of Texas. She was a Texas lady, a Texan, who supposedly caught the eye of Santa Anna and was able to get information from Santa Anna and get it to the Texans. But, so many stories, so many myths. We do know that there were various attacks on the Alamo from the Mexican army. And finally, on March 6th, the walls around the old church, actually the Alamo, the old walls around the mission actually didn't even really exist anymore. It was kind of more the church and a couple of walls around the church. Finally, on March 6th, the last attack on one of the walls fell, and the Mexican army was able to get inside the actual Alamo. That being said, more stories have been said that there were no survivors. Nobody was taken prisoner. And historians have debated this over and over. Were they all killed? We do know that Santa Anna issued no quarter. And what no quarter means, he was trying to make an example of these revolutionaries. And so no quarter means we're not going to hold anybody prisoner. Okay, we're not going to accept surrenders. We are basically, if you're caught, you will be killed. And that no quarter, no mercy giving. And so we do know that apart from those that died in battle, we think that Davy Crockett was actually captured alive, as well as some of his other Tennessee volunteers. We do know that pretty much everybody at the Alamo was killed either during the battle or after the battle. We also know that 3 people did survive the Alamo, and that was the slave of Jim Bowie. He had a slave with him at the Alamo, and who had actually, we believe, had been given his freedom, and he decided to stay with Jim Bowie. Jim Bowie was hurt, and so he stayed with him. Jim Bowie was killed. But Jim Bowie, the wife of William Travis, and her child were actually allowed to leave the Alamo alive. Anyhow, the Alamo bought time for General Sam Houston. And when the news arrives to Sam Houston that pretty much there were really no survivors at the Alamo, becomes a battle cry for many of his volunteers. In Goliad, on March 27, 1836, there's also another example given to the revolutionaries to back down. Colonel Fanning, who had already sent word to the Alamo that he could not send reinforcements because he was being surrounded by General Judea. Judea is able to overtake the mission at Goliad, where Fanning was located. And he does capture these individuals, and he actually is able to send a message to Santa Anna that he wants to give them mercy, that there should be no reason why they should all be killed. They acted to defend their ideas, and that was it. And he was just keep them as prisoners of war. And Santa Anna said no. They are all to be killed. 303 Texans were killed because Santa Anna wants to make an example. There was what is called the Angel of Goliad. As these men were all shot kind of on a shooting line, some of them feigned that they had been killed. All the bodies start kind of falling all in one place, and some of them pretended to be dead. And there was a lady that went through the bodies, trying to, after the shooting, tried to save those that had made it through. But remember the Alamo, and remember Goliad became a big battle cry for many of the Texans and the Tejanos. It was seen as just a very big example of corrupt power, what Santa Anna had done, centralized power. General Sam Houston decided to push further east with his army, partly getting closer to the U.S. border on the Sabine River, which was the border with Louisiana. There is a reason for this. Sam Houston, who had been a personal friend at the time, this is the 1830s, of the President of the United States, Andrew Jackson. They were both from Tennessee. He was hoping that his friend, Andrew Jackson, might get involved in this and might give Texas some help. The other reason he's going further east is he's making Santa Anna's supply line get longer. As he gets near the San Antonio River, the Texans hear that Santa Anna is very close. And they later hear that Santa Anna has put his camp in kind of like a peninsula bend in the river. Remember, peninsula is what hurt over at the Battle of Yorktown. Well, Santa Anna has very little respect for Sam Houston and his army. And so he's like, look, they're not going to attack us. They don't have the numbers. We'll just kind of set ourselves up here in San Jacinto River. Well, Houston says, fine. And they do a surprise attack on April 21st, 1836 on the Mexican camp. Santa Anna actually dressed up as a private, so they wouldn't realize that he was the actual generalissimo, and he's captured. And the Texans are putting all the prisoners into an area. And while they're there, the Texas guards are, guarding the Mexican prisoners. They won the battle. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. They won the battle. And they notice that a lot of the other soldiers seem to be deferring to a private, to this guy who doesn't have any insignia really on his uniform. There's something odd going on. And to their shock, they soon realize they've actually captured the president, the generalissimo, Santa Anna. And so Sam Houston, who was hurt in the battle, they bring Santa Anna to him, and they're able to negotiate a treaty. It's called the Treaty of Velasco. And basically the treaty ends the Texas Revolution, declares that Mexico recognizes Texas as independent, and Santa Anna signs it. And he's sent off back to Mexico on a ship. All Mexican troops are withdrawn from Texas south of the Rio Grande River. And I need you all to really understand that. All Mexican troops withdraw south of the Rio Grande River. Sam Houston goes on to be elected the first president of the Republic of Texas in 1836. And Houston actually is hoping Jackson President Jackson of the US will annex Texas because he kind of says we'll be protected from Mexico. They can help us with debt. But Jackson says, no, I don't want to annex Texas. And remember, Jackson is all about expansion and states' rights. He doesn't want to annex Texas. There are some very important reasons why he doesn't want to annex Texas. But before we get there, I want y'all to understand that Texas for 9 years is its own little country. The Republic of Texas between 1836 to 1845. Now, why didn't Jackson want to annex Texas? Here's a guy that's all about expansion and frontier. He's friends with Sam Houston, who's the president of Texas. Very simply, there's 2 reasons why Jackson didn't want to annex Texas. One, Texas had slaves. Now remember this, guys, the irony of this, because remember, Jackson doesn't have a problem with slavery. But Jackson realizes that if he brings in Texas as a slave state, it upsets the whole balance of power again. This whole issue of slavery expanding to the West explodes. And he's like, remember, he's a unionist first. He's like, no, I need to preserve the Union. I bring in Texas, and this is just exploding even bigger. No, I don't want Texas in. 2, Jackson says, there's a problem right now in Mexico. The problem is the border. Mexico said the Texas border was the Nueces River, which is over by Corpus Christi. Texas is saying, no, our border with Mexico is the Rio Grande River. All the army was withdrawn, Mexican army was withdrawn south of the Rio Grande River. Our border is the Rio Grande River. Jackson's like, you need to figure this out, because why am I going to bring in something that doesn't even have a clear border? Throughout those 9 years, Mexico never attempted to reclaim any part of Texas, nor send troops north of the Rio Grande River. So for all practical purposes, Mexico is saying, because of lack of action, that the border is the Rio Grande River, even though they state the border is the Nueces River. There is another problem. When Santa Anna arrives back in Mexico City, the Mexican government is like, you're an idiot. We're not going to recognize some treaty that you signed because you were under distress over there as a prisoner, and we don't even want you as president. And they actually send him off. He goes off into exile. He comes back into power, and he'll end up costing Mexico a lot more land, and he'll be exiled again. He's not a very popular figure in Mexican history. But so Mexico technically is not even recognizing that Texas is independent. But again, for 9 years, they never attempt to reclaim Texas. So Jackson is like, no, I don't want problems with Mexico. I don't want problems about a border issue that everybody is saying something different. And the slave debate, I'm not going to get into it. Martin Van Buren kind of follows the same idea, but James K. Polk in 1844, who had run on a campaign of annexation, not only of Texas, but Oregon, says, no, I'm going to go all for annexation. And he wins, and Texas will be annexed in 1845. It will come in as the 28th state of the United States. Now, Texas has certain privileges that other states do not have, mainly because it was its own country. And the US government recognized that when Texas was brought in as the 28th state. Now, Texas never had to be a territory. Other states didn't have to be territories, like Maine never had that status either, but that was a different situation. But Texas never had to be a territory because it had been a government. But things that are special for Texas, for example, all states, when you see like at the federal courthouses or anytime you see the US flag and a state flag, the US flag always has to be higher than a state flag. Very symbolic, right? US flag over a state flag. But in Texas, on March 2nd, 1836, the day of Texas independence, Texas is the only state allowed to raise that flag at equal height of the US flag to symbolize that Texas was once its own independent country. Texas also has the privilege, it is the only state that because of its size when it came in and because it was an independent republic, it could divide itself into 4 other states should it want. And until Alaska came, it's not a special privilege, but it's a special recognition. Until Alaska, Texas was considered the largest state in the United States. Alaska came in and we lost that to Alaska. Anyhow, now remember though, we talk about annexing with Texas. Texas says, fine, we're now part of the United States. And actually, many of the Texans wanted this because the US, they felt, would help them pay off debts and help them organize better. But there's disputed territory. Texas came into the United States claiming that the border was the Rio Grande River. And for 9 years, Mexico has done nothing to challenge that. Mexico, though, has insisted that the border was the Nueces River. And they were saying, look back at even the Spanish history we have. The province of Texas, or Texas, it was actually Texas y Coahuila, the border that very often was marked on the maps was the Nueces River. Texans say, no, the troops were withdrawn to the Rio Grande. It is the Rio Grande that is the border. And small technicality, Mexico has never recognized officially that Texas is independent. So when the U.S. annexes Texas, Mexico breaks off all diplomatic relations with the United States. So things are going to get really bad between the two border countries. There will be a war known as the Mexican-American War, the U.S.-Mexico War. It'll start in 1846, and it'll go for about 2 years to 1848. It starts right here in the Rio Grande Valley. Before we actually get into the war, though, there's been a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding the Mexican-American War. A lot of conspiracy theorists have always wanted to suggest that the United States took advantage of Mexico, manifest destiny, they wanted that land, and all this was kind of a ruse to attack Mexico and take over Mexico, at least its far northern lands. And yes, was Mexico economically poorer than the United States at the time? Yes, it was. Mexico, though, did have a larger standing army. It was a poor army. It didn't have the latest in weapons, but it was a much larger army. And when I hear all these conspiracy theories, I always wonder, but wait a minute, what one person might have wanted as opposed to actually getting a whole country to act that way and then actually having it happen, it's not a guarantee. This war against Mexico is not a guarantee. Mexico could have just as easily won the war because Mexico has to remain defensive. We're going to end up attacking. We have to invade Mexico. Our supply line gets long. We attack. When you do that, you are the one running the risk. What the other country has to do is remain defensive. So nothing is a guarantee. And I always caution all my students, be careful when you hear these conspiracy theories, because sometimes theories are mixed with emotion, with rationalizations for later actions that might show some prejudice and racism, but that's after. What we have to look at is this right now, and that was the war. So what happened? President ordered General Zachary Taylor to go to the northern bank of the Rio Grande River, near its mouth, basically today's Brownsville, and create a fort. Make an actual stand. This is U.S. territory. And they do. On the northern Rio Grande bank, north of the Mexican settlement of Matamoros. On April 24th, 1846, 1,600 Mexican soldiers went across the Rio Grande River and attacked an American detachment that was patrolling around the northern bank of the Rio Grande. Immediately, word was sent to Washington that American blood had been shed on American soil. Hostilities have commenced. Mexican soldiers send word to Mexico City. Mexicans have been invaded by the Americans. They're on Mexican territory. Do y'all see perceptions shape the way things are seen? Interesting little tidbit. Stationed in Brownsville, Fort Brown, will be two soldiers that actually served together. They weren't the best of friends. There's a difference in ages. But, and they met each other briefly. The older Robert E. Lee, a graduate of West Point, will briefly meet the younger U.S. Grant, also a graduate of West Point, and they will meet there in Brownsville. Briefly, they served together briefly. A little bit of a spoiler, these two will have other meetings later, and Robert E. Lee will be in charge of the Confederacy. U.S. Grant will be in charge of the Union Army. Both worked with great distinction and achieved great distinction in the U.S.-Mexican War, and both had great respect for each other. And again, Robert E. Lee was older than U.S. Grant, so there was admiration by U.S. Grant towards Robert E. Lee. So I'm not going to get into all the battles of the war. The U.S. actually invades Mexico. They go into Mexico. They also go by way of Veracruz. It's a war that pretty much ends up with a peace treaty really before anybody is like, big victory, we won the war. Nicholas Trist will negotiate a peace treaty with Mexico on February 2nd, 1848. This peace treaty is known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and it is really important that you all learn the points of this treaty. Mexico, point one, Mexico will cede New Mexico territories in California to the United States. These are basically Mexico's northern borderlands. Almost half of Mexico's territory, northern territory. The United States, point two, gives $15 million in war reparations for paying for damages for having invaded Mexico. Some people say it's kind of like a payment really for the Mexican cession. The Mexican cession were these lands ceded to the United States. The third point, the Rio Grande River is officially declared the border between Texas and Mexico. Point four, all Mexicans in the Mexican cession in these lands that are now ceded to the United States are guaranteed full U.S. citizenship. And the next point, their land claims, land titles are to be recognized and respected. And the United States will assume all citizens' claims against Mexico. So if anybody had lost anything to Mexico during this war, the United States is going to assume that debt. Mexico doesn't have to pay war reparations. This is the Mexican cession. And you can kind of see all of this land now given to Mexico. This little area right here that you see, kind of south of what is known as the Gila River, and you kind of see today the actual border that is extended. This will be a purchase done some years later called the Gadsden Purchase to kind of make the border with Mexico a little more straighter. But this is the Mexican cession. 500,000 square miles of land, which are now part of the United States. That is one of the results of this war with Mexico. Present day's California, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado and Wyoming. And like I said, in 1853, you have the Gadsden Purchase, which basically straightens out that Arizona-New Mexico border with Mexico. The reason I've always said be careful with those conspiracy theories is that if there was a big conspiracy to take Mexico, why not take all of Mexico? Some books, I disagree with parts of your book that talks about the intensity. Was there prejudice? Yes. And one of the things that we are going to see is that many of those new citizens, now U.S. citizens of Mexican descent, will be targeted with prejudice. And many of the new Mexican Americans will lose land. What happens? Many things. Taking advantage of the fact that they don't know English. They don't know the American laws, how to claim your lands, how to officially put your lands and titles into the courthouses. They're going to be taking advantage. They'll be taken advantage by people that do understand the laws to take their land. Yeah, there are some bad people. Posters, for example, that would be told or would be placed around places like Santa Fe. Please bring your title so that you can have it put into the new American courthouse. Were placed in places where they would not see it. They were placed in English. And what happens once their titles were not recognized, people could come in and buy their lands. They were considered free lands. Yeah, there was prejudice. Yes, there was taking advantage of, but was there a big conspiracy for this? We have to be careful with these kind of overall general questions. Another big question. With all this land now acquired by the Americans, what about slavery? Was there going to be slavery in these lands? These lands had been free lands. There hadn't really been slaves in New Mexico and Arizona and California and Colorado. One, slavery had never really been adopted there, and Mexico had banned slavery way before the United States even thought of banning slavery. But does slavery go west? Texas was a slave state. Would slavery go west? And that argument becomes one of the big issues of the 1850s. Does slavery go west? Also in 1848, a little thing happens. Gold is discovered in Northern California, north of Sacramento. All this gold or dreams of gold that are to be in Northern California is going to produce a mad rush to California. On January 24th, 1848, gold is discovered in California at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California, Northern California, by James Marshall. And between 1848 to 1849, over 1 million people are rushing to California to try their chance at gold. They're called the 49ers because they're arriving in 1849. Ever wonder where the San Francisco 49ers get their name? From the gold rush. And they're all going to Northern California, and San Francisco booms, and it becomes a thriving financial center and port, major port on the Pacific coast. By 1850, California has over 1 million in population, and they want to be a state. And so they're asking the government to become a state. And California will come in as a free state. It doesn't have slaves. What to do? And that, guys, opens up a huge can of worms, the 1850s. So let me see the time real quick. Okay, I'm going to take advantage of this time. I'm going to give you all about 10 more minutes of lecture, but I just need to get out of this because we are now out of expand. Hello, guys. Sorry about that. Are y'all still there? I am so sorry. I pressed the wrong button. Let me go back. I'm going to stop sharing this and go to a new sharing of files. I am so sorry. How do I stop sharing there? Okay, sorry. I accidentally clicked the wrong button and signed myself out. Let me go ahead and share some new files with y'all. Okay. Choose. Very good question, Ethan. Your quiz, I've decided it is after today's lecture. Everybody there, everybody's listening. You are having a quiz after last week's lecture, today's lecture, and the week before. But I decided I'm going to post the quiz on Friday. So y'all can enjoy Thanksgiving and relax and not have to take the quiz today or Wednesday or thing. You can relax. Okay, so the quiz is going to be posted. You do have a quiz, but it will be on Friday. So you can actually, and you'll have a day to do it. So you can relax a little bit. Okay, let me just get here to share now. And thank you for the question, Ethan. I forgot to mention that earlier. Share now. Okay. Okay. I won't press any more buttons as we have the last kind of 10 minutes of class. What I really want y'all to understand is that the 1850s open up, and already the first question that everybody's having to deal with is slavery again. I mean, and what's going to happen in this decade of the 1850s is that almost every year something happens. Something happens to further polarize, further divide the North and the South. And almost every one of those things between 1850 to 1861 are things that shape a destiny, that are literally on a collision course for civil war. And the very first thing is going to be what to do about slavery to the West, California. Everything, though, guys, by the 1850s, it's as if two countries are living under one flag. Everything divided. The people are divided over slavery, over whether it should expand to the West, over the theories of states' rights, over who controlled Washington. Our culture, the way we dressed, the way we talked, the way we lived, everything was completely opposite almost. Our social lives were different. it's just everything is leading for this collision course. And that collision course is going to be the presidential election of 1860. When a president is elected without one single slaveholding state voting for him. And at that point, South Carolina, who had led the call for nullification and secession, secedes, taking it with other states, and everything leads to civil war. But let's go back. That 1850 issue with California and what to do about all that land that has now been ceded from Mexico, the Mexican cession. California is like, we've got 1 million people here. We are very popular. We want to be a state. So we didn't have slaves. Big deal. We were free land. Okay. But what about, people ask, New Mexico? What will be Arizona? They have not traditionally been slave lands. Should we allow slavery in there? In 1846, right before the war passed, and this is why some conspiracy theorists have said there was a conspiracy there, a proviso, an attachment to the Declaration of War was attempted to be passed that slavery be banned in any lands acquired in a war against Mexico in 1846. It did not pass. It shows you, though, that people are already thinking, what do we do about slavery to the West if we acquire more land to the West? California wants to come in. And what's happening in 1850 is that, again, sectional division. The North is saying, yes, bring in California. Southerners are like, no, 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 we don't need California. Wait, wait, wait. Enter Henry Clay, the great compromiser. By 1850s, he's very old already, and he belongs to the party of the Whigs. And he brings on with him another politician who actually takes on the mantle of compromiser. He's younger. His name is Stephen Douglas, and he's from Illinois, and he's a Democrat. And they put together this kind of compromise to allow California to come into the United States as a state. 5 actual bills are passed as this compromise of 1850 is organized. And the idea is not only dealing with California, but also about the lands of the Mexican cession. So what is the compromise of 1850? Okay, so 5 different laws, 5, I did 10, 5 different laws passed to kind of deal with these issues. 1, California is accepted as a free state. That's kind of plain and simple. 2, with regards to the Mexican cession, New Mexico territories, Utah territories, New Mexico and Utah were basically, New Mexico is New Mexico and Colorado and Arizona, and Utah was Utah and Colorado and Nevada. In these territories by the Mexican cession, they're going to declare it popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty. You know what, guys? It is 10:43. You know what? The compromise of 1850 is kind of long. So why don't we end it here? We'll pick up on Tuesday, next Tuesday, with the popular sovereignty, with the compromise of 1850 and the Civil War next week. And we'll be done. So I'll go ahead and let you all out. And safe driving, Ethan. Take care of my little cousin. And you all be safe and sound. Everybody have a happy Thanksgiving. And I have a question from Sierra. Very good question. Are we going to have to do the 50 terms for the study guide? No, y'all get a break, so you don't have to do that. But use it as a study guide for the final. Think of it, guys. You may not have an essay on that final, but that's a lot of multiple choice and short answers you may have to do on that final. Karina, are you still there? If you can hold on, I know we need to talk, and the rest of y'all can go. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Okay, Sierra, you got your answer.